They told me I was crazy. They said my seawall was an eyesore, they had it torn down. But they didn't know what was coming, and when the wave hit, I was the only one ready. My name is Ethan Miller, and I live in Seabreeze Cove, a slice of paradise on the California coastline. My home isn't a massive mansion. It's a 2-story cedar house with a wraparound porch and floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a panoramic view of the Pacific. It's the kind of place you build with your own 2 hands, with every plank and nail holding a memory. I moved here to find peace after a difficult time in my life, and this home, with its endless view of the rolling waves, gave me just that. My days were a simple rhythm of the tide coming in and going out. I'd wake up with the sunrise, drink my coffee on the porch as the sky turned from deep violet to fiery orange, and end the day watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the water in gold and crimson, the crown jewel of my property in the house itself. But the seawall that stood steadfast at the edge of my lawn, it wasn't a standard concrete slab. I'd spent 6 months building it myself, with rocks gathered from local quarries and reinforced with rebar and a special type of marine-grade cement I'd researched for months. The stones were hand-laid, a mosaic of granite and sandstone that curved gently with the natural line of the beach. Neighbors often commented on its rustic, almost artistic beauty, how it seemed to be a part of the landscape rather than an intrusion. It was more than a wall, it was a promise that no matter what the ocean threw at me, my home, my sanctuary would remain safe. But this peace was not to last. The Homeowners Association HOA, a committee of self-appointed guardians of neighborhood harmony, decided my seawall was a problem. Their president was a woman named Victoria Vance. She was a force of nature in her own right, a petite, impeccably dressed woman who wore her power like a second skin. Victoria didn't just enforce rules, she believed in them with a zealous fervor. Her own home was a sterile, minimalist structure that looked as if it had been airbrushed straight from the pages of a luxury magazine. She found my rugged, custom-built wall offensive to her vision of a manicured, uniform community. The first signs of trouble were subtle. A newsletter mention about preserving aesthetic continuity, then a polite but pointed email about architectural inconsistencies. I ignored them, convinced that once they saw the wall's craftsmanship and utility, they would understand. I was naive. Victoria's next move was not an email, but a direct, public confrontation at a community meeting. "Mr. Miller's personal project is a blight," she said, her voice like ice. "It detracts from the uniform elegance of our coastline and sets a dangerous precedent for individualism over community standards." Most of the neighbors stayed silent, too intimidated to speak against her. I tried to reason with her, to explain the wall's stability and its purpose, but she simply cut me off with a dismissive wave of her hand. A week later, the letter arrived. It was delivered via certified mail, a thick envelope with the HOA's official seal on it. The text was cold, impersonal, and laden with legal jargon I barely understood. It cited bylaw section 14.3b, an obscure rule about unapproved shoreline structures. The words swam before my eyes, but the message was chillingly clear. My seawall was a violation. The document demanded its complete demolition within 30 days, and stated that if I didn't comply, the HOA would arrange for its removal and charge me all associated costs, along with a daily fine of $500. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hands, the sound of the waves now a menacing whisper against the very thing they wanted to tear down. The sanctuary I had built was under attack, and I was all alone. What would I do? What could I do? The letter was more than a demand. It was a gauntlet thrown at my feet. The tranquility of Seabreeze Cove was now a battlefield, and I was the lone soldier facing an entire army. I immediately called a lawyer, a family friend from a city 2 hours inland. His specialty was corporate law, not property disputes, but he was the only legal mind I knew. After reading the HOA's demand, he sighed. "Ethan, your heart's in the right place, but this is an uphill battle. HOAs have a lot of power, and their bylaws are often airtight. This Victoria Vance seems to know her stuff. Your best bet is to appeal to the board directly, maybe compromise on the aesthetics, but don't hold your breath. His advice sent me on a frantic campaign. I printed high-resolution photographs of other custom seawalls from magazines and architectural blogs, all more individual than mine, all celebrated for their unique designs. I gathered signatures from the handful of neighbors who had previously admired my work. I even compiled a detailed report, a small binder full of structural analyses and geological data that proved my wall was more than just beautiful. It was an engineering marvel, a necessary shield against coastal erosion. I presented all of this at the next HOA meeting, a tense, silent affair held in the community clubhouse. Victoria Vance sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of polite indifference. She let me speak, her eyes scanning the faces of the other board members, each one on a lie she had carefully selected. As I spoke, her expression never changed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't debate. She didn't even acknowledge the architectural evidence or the petition I had submitted. When I was finished, she simply picked up a tablet, swiped once, and said, "The board has already reviewed your appeal. It has been unanimously denied. Our decision is final. The demolition crew is scheduled to arrive in 7 days." The other board members murmured their agreement. There was no discussion, no vote, no sense of democracy. Just a cold, calculated dismissal. I stood there, stunned. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive. I had put all my hope into this meeting, and in one swift, chilling motion, it had been crushed. The next 6 days passed in a blur of last-ditch efforts. I called every legal counsel I could find, but they all gave me the same response. The HOA has the power. One lawyer told me bluntly, "You signed the contract when you bought the property. Your options are to comply or face an expensive lawsuit you will almost certainly lose." I considered chaining myself to the wall, staging a protest, but the thought was a fleeting one. That wasn't me. I was a man of peace, not a rabble-rouser. A part of me even hoped for a miracle, that Victoria would have a change of heart. I was foolish to think so. She was not a woman who understood compromise. She only understood victory. On the morning of the demolition, the air was still and humid, a strange calm before a storm. I stood on my porch, my cup of coffee cold in my hands, and watched them arrive. It wasn't just one truck. It was a fleet of heavy-duty vehicles, a backhoe, a dump truck, and a crew of men in hard hats. Victoria Vance was there too, directing them with a clipboard in hand, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. She was like a general overseeing a conquered territory. I felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by a profound emptiness. This wasn't a wall they were tearing down. They were tearing down a part of me, a symbol of my hard-won peace. The sound was what broke me, the first impact of the backhoe against the carefully placed stones of my wall, a loud, jarring crunch that echoed across the quiet beach. It was a sound of violation. I watched in a numb trance as the machine tore into the mosaic I had so painstakingly built. Each clatter of falling rock, each spray of dust was a punch to the gut. The rebar, the very skeleton of the wall, was exposed and twisted, a gruesome sight. I saw the faces of some of my neighbors watching from their windows, but they quickly looked away. They were afraid, and I didn't blame them. Victoria had made an example of me. My wall was a warning to anyone else who dared to step out of line. Within an hour, my beautiful, protective wall was reduced to a pile of rubble. The crew worked with an efficiency that was both impressive and horrifying. When they finished, they loaded the broken stones into the dump truck and drove away, leaving a jagged, gaping wound on the edge of my property. Victoria Vance gave me one final, triumphant glance, a silent confirmation of her victory, before she, too, drove away. I walked down to the edge of the beach, the sand and chino completely exposed to my house, a small piece of rebar, a mangled remnant of the wall's strength, lay half buried in the sand. I picked it up, feeling the cold, twisted metal in my hand. My sanctuary was gone. My defenses were gone. I was defeated. And as the tide began to creep back in, I had a terrible, sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. The silence after the demolition was more deafening than the roar of the backhoe. It was the silence of a void, a silent invitation for the unknown. For 2 days, I lived in a state of suspended grief, staring out at the exposed sand. The house felt hollow, a body without its protective shell. I spent my time in my home office, a space I designed for quiet reflection, poring over old blueprints and geological surveys of the coastline. It was a futile attempt to regain a sense of control over something I had lost forever, but a strange thing happened. While reviewing a seismic report for a university study, a pattern caught my eye: a series of small, almost negligible tremors in a deep-water fault line a few hundred miles offshore. Alone, they meant nothing, but when I cross-referenced the data with historical records, I found a chilling similarity to a series of quakes that had preceded a minor tidal surge in the region 3 decades ago. The pattern was subtle, but it was there. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. This wasn't about the HOA anymore. This was about something far bigger, something the ocean had been whispering about for days. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just a coincidence, a desperate man looking for a reason to have a wall he no longer possessed, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I started noticing other small things, signs the locals, too, would have dismissed. The gulls were flying. Further inland, the tide was pulling back further than usual, exposing parts of the beach I'd never seen before. A strange, metallic taste lingered in the air. These were old fishermen's tales, signs of a coming storm. I wasn't a fisherman, but a part of me, the part that had built my home from the ground up and understood the rhythms of the sea, knew something was profoundly wrong. My first thought was to warn my neighbors, but I knew they wouldn't listen, not after what Victoria had done. So I went to the source. I called Victoria Vance directly. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and impatient. "Mr. Miller, I don't believe we have anything left to discuss." I took a deep breath. "Victoria, this isn't about the wall. I've been looking at some seismic data, and I think there's a risk of a significant surge. I've seen some worrying signs. The tide, the animal behavior. I think you need to tell the board to issue a public warning." There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a dry, humorless laugh. "A surge, Ethan? Are you listening to yourself? We just spent a significant amount of the HOA's budget cleaning up your mess, and now you're inventing a tidal threat. I can't believe I'm still talking to you. This is paranoia, pure and simple. I suggest you focus on cleaning up your own property, not on spreading baseless fear." She hung up before I could say another word. I tried calling a couple of other board members, people I'd had passing, pleasant conversations with in the past. They didn't even pick up. They'd either been instructed not to, or they were too scared to get on Victoria's bad side. They saw me as the crazy man who had a wall torn down, a cautionary tale. I sent out an email to the entire community, explaining what I had found and urging them to take precautions. The only response I got was an angry email from Victoria, a short, vicious note accusing me of trying to sabotage the HOA and threatening further legal action. The helplessness was overwhelming. I had the knowledge, but no one would listen. I felt a sense of responsibility for the people around me, people who had been too afraid to stand up for me, and yet I couldn't get them to hear me. I sat in my office, watching the sea. The horizon was a calm, deceptive line. But I knew better. I'd seen the data. I'd seen the signs. It was a pressure cooker, and it was about to blow. Then, just as the sun began to set, my phone buzzed with an emergency alert. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. Tsunami advisory issued for coastal California. I ran to the television, flicking it on. Every channel was showing the same live broadcast from the National Weather Service. A meteorologist, his face pale with worry, pointed at a map. We're seeing a rare, fast-moving seismic event in the deep ocean, creating a significant tsunami wave. Residents in low-lying coastal areas are advised to evacuate immediately. The screen behind him showed a computer simulation of a massive blue wave, heading straight for Seabreeze Cove. I looked out my window at a peaceful, quiet beach. The sky was still painted with the gentle colors of dusk, but I now knew that beneath that serene surface, a force of unimaginable destruction was on its way. They hadn't believed me. Now, they were all about to find out the hard way. The emergency alert had a chilling finality to it. The serene coastal evening that had just moments ago been filled with the gentle hum of cicadas and the distant sound of the surf was now a canvas of sheer terror. Car alarms began to shriek in the distance, a desperate chorus of chaos as people scrambled to escape. I stood frozen at my window, watching the calm blue line of the ocean horizon. It was a lie. The television screen still blared with the terrifying simulation, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of what came next. The gentle whisper of the waves was slowly, inexorably, replaced by a low rumble. It was a sound that didn't just reach my ears, it resonated in my bones. It grew from a distant thunder to a freight train, and then to a monstrous, roaring beast that was consuming everything in its path. I watched, unable to breathe, as the horizon line began to swell, not with a gentle curve, but with a sudden, violent rise. It was a solid wall of dark, churning water, 1,000 feet high, a fluid mountain topped with a crown of hissing foam. It was impossibly fast, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that there was no escape for anyone. The moment the wave hit the first homes was a horrifying spectacle of sound and fury. I watched as the perfectly manicured, aesthetically pleasing houses of the HOA's most loyal members were reduced to matchsticks. The homes built on the proved single-slab foundations simply crumbled as the water slammed into them. The elegant columns of the house to my left splintered, and the roof peeled away like a tin can lid. I saw a neighbor's expensive sports car lifted from his driveway and spun like a toy. It was an indiscriminate force, an absolute and final verdict on the hubris of the community. I saw the minimalist, perfectly symmetrical facade of Victoria Vance's home. It stood there for a split second, a defiant symbol of her rigid control, before the wave hit it with a sickening crash. The glass walls imploded, the walls buckled, and the entire structure vanished into the churning, muddy vortex, leaving nothing but a gaping, watery hole where it once stood. And then, it was my turn. The roar was now a deafening, vibrating reality. The ground beneath me shook, the glass in my windows rattled violently, and I braced myself for the end. I had no illusions. My house was built to withstand the elements, but this was a force of nature unlike anything I had ever prepared for. The wave struck with a sound that felt like the world ending. My home shuddered violently. I heard the sickening groan of wood, the sound of my porch railing being ripped away. But then something else happened. Beneath the floorboards, a solid, unyielding resistance met the force of the water. The house shook, but it did not break. It was my secret, my hidden failsafe. When I was building my seawall, I had the foresight to dig another 12 feet down, pouring a second, deeper foundation of reinforced concrete that extended into the bedrock. It was a measure no one would ever see, a personal assurance against the very thing I had just witnessed. When the demolition crew had torn down the visible wall, they hadn't been able to reach this deep, solid base. My house, therefore, still had its protective shield. For a long, agonizing minute, the world was a cacophony of breaking wood, shattering glass, and the terrifying, churning roar of the ocean. My home was an island in a sea of destruction. The water slammed against my lower foundation, but my walls held firm. The force of the wave was so immense it crested over the house, and I was plunged into a world of muddy darkness. I closed my eyes, a silent prayer on my lips, holding onto the hope that my own careful work would save me. When the water receded, it was not with a gentle withdrawal, but with a powerful, sucking vacuum. The sound of destruction was replaced by a hollow, draining roar. I slowly opened my eyes. Outside, my yard was a wasteland of splintered wood, mangled cars, and the remnants of what were once homes. The once manicured lawn was gone, replaced by a mud-slicked expanse littered with debris. But my house, my little cedar sanctuary, stood firm. It was battered, but it was whole. I walked over to the now vacant space where Victoria's home once stood. Nothing but a foundation and a few floating pieces of wreckage remained. I looked across the devastated coastline, and a profound, bone-deep sorrow washed over me. I had survived, but the entire community I had tried to warn was gone. The silence that followed the storm was a heavy blanket, a monument to the price of pride and the tragic consequence of ignoring a warning. The rising sun on the morning after the tsunami was a cruel, golden light that illuminated the scale of the devastation. The peaceful, manicured community of Seabreeze Cove was now a landscape of broken promises and splintered dreams. Debris was everywhere, the mangled remains of furniture, scattered belongings, and the sad, splintered remains of what were once elegant homes. In the hollow where Victoria Vance's house had stood, all that remained was the concrete slab of her foundation, a testament to what a home truly is without a solid base. I stood on my porch, my home battered but intact, a lone beacon in a sea of ruin. I could hear the faint sound of sirens and helicopters in the distance, but for now, it was just me and the broken community around me. I didn't gloat. There was no victory in this, just a profound, heartbreaking sadness for the people who had lost everything. My first move was not to celebrate, but to act. I went into my garage, grabbed a first aid kit, and started walking toward the nearest wreckage. I found my neighbor, a kind old man named Frank, sitting on the steps of what used to be his front door. He was in shock, his face streaked with mud and tears, holding a photograph of his late wife. I sat beside him, not saying a word, and simply handed him a bottle of water. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a broken disbelief. You were right," he whispered, his voice cracking. I just shook my head and said, "It doesn't matter who was right. We're going to get through this, together." Word of my home's survival spread quickly. The other neighbors, disoriented and humbled, began to emerge from what was left of their houses. Their faces, once filled with polite avoidance, were now a mix of shame, relief, and desperate gratitude. They looked at my intact home not with resentment, but with a new sense of understanding. It was a physical manifestation of what I had tried to tell them all along, that genuine safety and stability were more important than a superficial sense of uniformity. They had been so focused on outward appearances, on conforming to Victoria's vision of perfection, that they had overlooked the true substance beneath. Then I saw her. Victoria Vance. She was a sight to behold, a ghost of her former self. Her crisp designer clothes were torn and mud-stained. Her hair was matted, and her face was a mask of grief. She wasn't carrying a clipboard or giving orders. She was just standing, a solitary figure in the middle of the street, staring at the empty space where her home used to be. The symbol of her control had been swept away in an instant. She looked up and saw me. The fierce pride in her eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, broken emptiness. She started to walk toward me, her steps slow and hesitant, as if the ground beneath her had become unfamiliar. She didn't say a word. She just looked at my house, then back at me, a silent, powerful apology. I simply nodded, a gesture of quiet forgiveness, and offered her a bottle of water too. She took it, her hand trembling, and for the first time, I saw her not as an antagonist, but as a person who had lost everything because of her own blindness. In the days that followed, the true rebuilding began, and it wasn't just physical. We worked together, side by side. I used my expertise to help others assess the damage, to salvage what they could, and to plan for the future. We weren't a collection of neighbors anymore, we were a community. Victoria Vance, now just Victoria, worked harder than anyone. She was a woman of action, and she channeled her energy into helping others, a silent atonement for her mistakes. The new Seabreeze Cove would not be a place of sterile uniformity, but a place of strength, resilience, and compassion, with new homes and, perhaps, one day, new sea walls built with a new understanding that a true foundation isn't something you can see on the surface. It's what you build with foresight, humility, and the collective strength of a community. My wall had saved my home, but the tsunami had done something more profound. It had washed away the pride, arrogance, and discord that had divided us, leaving behind a blank slate on which we could finally build something real.